Okay, welcome everyone. It's just after 12 o'clock noon on the East Coast in the United States. I want to join those who are coming to us on Facebook Live here in the US and around the world. It's a delight to be with you. This is our latest Zoom virtual policy forum at the Washington Institute. My name is David Makowski, a Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute. And this is a latest in our series that looks at dimensions of the Israel-Palestinian situation. Our last one was on Palestinian succession, the one before that on annexation, and this one is going to focus on really on Palestinian polling, hard data on some of the hardest questions. Really a delight. It's centered on Dave Pollock's latest publication that I'd urge you all to read. He's done a real service to everyone, I believe, by really compiling 10 years of data of Palestinian polls. He asks both shorter term questions, but longer term questions, and he keeps to those questions over time. So you get a contrast over time, you get a contrast on the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And it's all face-to-face interviews. That's very labor intensive. So that adds, I think, to the credibility, and it's really a delight to celebrate this latest work of our colleague Dave Pollock. And he is the Bernstein Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute. Also joining is Ghaith al-Omari. Ghaith is our in-house expert on domestic Palestinian politics. Of course, his views are also on the wider Israeli-Palestinian situation as well. He was once a Palestinian negotiator at Camp David, worked with President Abbas, and a colleague of ours here that we're really delighted for the last several years of the Washington Institute. Tamar Herman, our third pollster, is really one of Israel's leading figures in Israel. She is, when it comes to polling, she's a political science professor at the Open University in Israel. She's the academic director of the Gutman Center of Public Opinion and Policy Research at the Israel Democracy Institute. Many of you have seen her polls. She's also done this over time with the Peace Index since 1994, along with Ehud Yaari at Tel Aviv University. And it's really a delight to have really such a great expert panel. So we're going to dive in. Afterwards, I'll start with a question or so, and then feel free to email your questions. It's not we're not doing this through Zoom for most of you, so just email them at policyforum@washingtoninstitute, .org, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And it's an important topic, and we've got an excellent panel, and so let's dive right in. And our order is going to be Dave will open us up and talk about his new work. Tamar, who's a fellow pollster, will respond at the perspective from Israel, and then we'll go to Ghaith, who will talk about the policy implications for the Palestinians based on what he has heard. So we got two great discussants, and to join Dave Pollock with his new publication. Dave, why don't you start us off?
Great. Thank you so much, David, and thanks to my fellow panelists, Ghaith and Tamar, and of course to the Washington Institute for sponsoring my work and sponsoring this event, and to all of you for participating in it. I'm going to start with just a few words about methodology, and before your eyes glaze over, as they sometimes do when people say the word methodology, I'm going to be extremely brief. These are all, as David Makowski said, face-to-face surveys, but equally important, these are surveys that are done by Palestinians of Palestinians. I organize the surveys, and the Washington Institute sponsors them, and I personally go to the field to help the team of Palestinian professionals execute the surveys, but these are done by local people in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem, and they're very professional. I have extremely high confidence in the credibility and the integrity of all of these polling results. And just to make sure, I also compare the polls that I organize and that are carried out by Palestinian pollsters. I also compare them with other polls that are done by different Palestinian pollsters. And if you want to read more about all of that, you can read it in this, which is the new monograph that the Washington Institute and I just published. It's called A Nation Divided. And it is about 10 years worth, a whole decade's worth of Palestinian survey data results on, as the title of this event says, hard data on the hardest questions. It's also available, the publication online as a PDF, free of charge. In addition, the data behind all of these surveys is available online in an online annex to the publication. So you can read every single response to every single question, searchable by year, asked over the last decade, if you want to follow up on any of the data. Enough about methodology. I want to talk about why I put the title A Nation Divided to discuss Palestinian public opinion, because that's not usually the way Palestinian public opinion is presented. It's more often presented, I think, as some kind of monolithic view, but that is very far from the truth. The truth is that the Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza and East Jerusalem are divided, and that their answers differ in many different ways. And the first way in which their answers differ is over time. That is to say, Palestinian public opinion on questions of war and peace with Israel, as the subtitle of my monograph has it, are not the same over time. They change. And if there's any one thing that I would like all of you to take away from this discussion, it's exactly that. Palestinian public opinion is not impervious to changes that occur over time in the circumstances under which they live, in Israeli policies, in American policies on the Palestinian issue, in internal developments inside the Palestinian arena. All of those things affect Palestinian public opinion, and there are ups and downs in popular attitudes among the Palestinians that are very significant. In order to illustrate that point, I am going to tell you a personal anecdote about the very first time that I was out in the field supervising a Palestinian public opinion poll. And this was way back in the spring of 1994, May 31st, 1994, to be exact. It was the first scientific, that means probability sample, Palestinian poll that was ever done, and I was privileged to be sent out there into the field by the US government, where I worked at the time, in order to help train the Palestinians in how to do scientific surveys. So I was out there with a Palestinian field worker, a guy named Samir, and we were in his hometown of Anabta, a very pretty village in the northern West Bank. And we were going door to door in a random walk, a standard geographic probability procedure, which is the way all of these polls are done, door to door, knocking on individual households selected at random and interviewing a person in each house that we selected, also selected at random, in order to get a true random sample of the Palestinian population. And at the end of that day, Samir said to me, David, you know what? We've come to the last household that we're going to be interviewing today. Why don't you do the interview? You speak fluent Arabic. Maybe it would be interesting for you to go inside and actually interview someone in that household to round up our work for the day. And I said, sure. So I went into the house with the questionnaire in my hand. And when I got inside, I found middle-aged woman, all dressed in black. And as I looked around the house, I saw that everything in the house was all draped in black, including photographs of a young man. And it instantly struck me that I was in the presence of a woman who had lost a son in the Intifada not too many years before, and who was still in mourning for that loss. And under those circumstances, I had to conduct a very difficult interview, but I did it. And the mother completed the interview, answered all the questions about a two-state solution and possible peace with Israel and Palestinian historical claims against the Israelis and the cost of the Intifada and everything else, the hardest questions. But when I left that interview and I saw Samir standing outside, I was very angry with him for having put me into this kind of difficult emotional situation. And I said to him, Samir, did you know when you sent me into that house to do the interview that I was going to be interviewing a woman who had lost a son to the Israelis during the Intifada? And Samir, my Palestinian colleague, said, yes, David, I know. That's my mother. And that's why, Samir said back in 1994. And that's exactly why I believe, and most of my fellow Palestinians believe, that we finally need to have peace with Israel, permanent peace, put an end to the suffering and the dying and the killing, reach a compromise, accept a two-state solution, and end the conflict once and for all. But that was then, more than 25 years ago. And this is now. And I have to say that in the last decade, as is spelled out in extraordinary detail in my monograph, and as I'm going to share with you just some headlines today, Palestinian public opinion has moved in a less conciliatory, a more militant direction. Palestinians have lost faith and hope in the idea that there will be a two-state solution, or even that if there is one, that should be the end of conflict with Israel. So that today, the data that I have from polls done as recently as last February, just a few months ago, show unmistakably that support for a two-state solution is now a minority position among the Palestinian public in the West Bank, in Gaza, and even in East Jerusalem. Instead, what do the Palestinians want now? Well, they don't want a one-state solution. Despite a lot of loose talk about how this idea is gaining traction, the fact is, based on these surveys, that among the Palestinians, it is not gaining traction. The idea of a binational state in which Jews and Arabs would enjoy equal rights living in one state together attracts only about 10% of the Palestinian public these days. And that number has not changed, has not risen in recent years. So if the majority of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem today don't want a two-state solution, and they don't want a one-state solution, what do they want? And the answer, I'm afraid, is that in recent years, and right up until today, 2020, the majority of the Palestinian public in each one of those territories picks as its preferred option regaining all of historic Palestine for the Palestinians from the river to the sea. Not coexistence with Israel, not one state in which Arabs and Jews would live together as equals. No, regaining all of Palestine for the Palestinians, a far cry from what Samir told me in the heady days right after the first Oslo Agreement back in the early 1990s. And no matter how you ask this question, and I ask it many different ways, many different times over the last decade, what I see today and in the last few years is, if you ask, for example, Palestinians, what if we do get a two-state solution? What if we do get an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem? Should that be the end of conflict with Israel? Should that mean permanent peace with Israel? And in every survey in the last few years, the majority of the Palestinian public says, no, that should not be the end of the conflict. The conflict should continue until we Palestinians regain all of historic Palestine for ourselves. There's been a lot of talk recently about how the Israeli public has drifted away from simple acceptance of a two-state solution. But the fact is that the Palestinian public has also moved sharply away from that idea. I'm sorry to have to say this, but the numbers don't lie. So now let me talk about a different kind of division that we see among Palestinians. And that's differences between the different territories in which these polls are conducted and in which the Palestinians live: the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. May I have the first slide, please? And I'm going to jump right into, as the title says, the hardest questions. This is a question about annexation. And I did polls about this in mid-2019, and then again in January, February of this year, just a few months ago. And I asked, how should the Palestinians react if the Israelis annex more West Bank territory? And what you can see here, this is the West Bank. What you can see here, and it's quite counterintuitive, I think, is that the percentage of Palestinians in the West Bank who said that the Palestinians should oppose Israeli annexation, even by force if necessary, actually declined in the last year. So that today, only 25% of the Palestinians in the West Bank strongly agree that the Palestinians should oppose Israeli annexation, even by force, if necessary. And that's just about exactly the same percentage of West Bank Palestinians who say, in response to a related question, that they want an intifada against Israel, if they are given other options to choose from. So what I gather from this is that the prospects of an intifada in the West Bank against Israeli annexation, even if that does happen, are actually relatively low. Only a quarter of the Palestinian public would support that. And I'll come back at the end of my remarks to what difference I think that makes to the Palestinian leadership and other governments. Now let's look at Gaza. In Gaza, the percentage of Palestinians who say that they should oppose Israeli annexation in the West Bank, even by force, if necessary, is much higher than it is in the West Bank. But this is actually typical in the sense that the Palestinians in each territory have different attitudes. Sometimes these attitudes differ, as you can see here, by 30 or 40 points. And it's typically the Palestinians in Gaza who want the Palestinians in the West Bank to have an intifada, or the Palestinians in the West Bank who want the Palestinians in Gaza to fire rockets and missiles and have violent border protests against Israel. It's always the people in one territory who are more likely to want the people in the other territory to engage in armed confrontations against Israel and to suffer the consequences as a result. Next slide, please. Now let's look separately at East Jerusalem, which is something that I think has sometimes amazing results, as you'll see in just a moment. In East Jerusalem, there are about 350,000 Palestinians who live under Israeli rule, but in very different circumstances, because given their residence permits in East Jerusalem, the Israelis allow them to travel freely in Israel, to work in Israel, to enjoy the social safety net and various economic benefits and educational opportunities that Israelis also enjoy, Arabs or Jews alike, unlike the Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank. And for a long time, these 350,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem had much more moderate attitudes toward Israel and Israelis as a result of their different circumstances. And they explained to pollsters that for practical reasons, they were more content to live with Israelis and even under Israeli rule. But today, as you can see here, the Palestinians in East Jerusalem have about the same attitudes toward armed confrontation with Israel against Israeli annexation as do their brothers and cousins on the West Bank. Today, the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are no more moderate than those on the other side of the security barrier. And that is a gigantic change over just the last 5 years. And it's one that I'm going to explain without a slide now, and I'm going to explain as follows. In 2010, when I started doing these polls for the Washington Institute, the percentage of East Jerusalem Palestinians who said that they would rather be citizens of Israel than of a Palestinian state was 35%. A third said they would rather be Israeli citizens than citizens of a new Palestinian state. And that percentage went up in the next few years to 42% in 2011 to 52%. A majority of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem back then, 5 years ago, said that they would rather be citizens of Israel than of a Palestinian state if they had to make that choice. But in the last 5 years, those numbers have reversed in one of the most dramatic changes in public opinion that I have ever seen anywhere. And today, the percentage of East Jerusalem Palestinians who say that if they had to choose, they'd rather be citizens of Israel is only about 10%. The vast majority now say have become more alienated from Israel as a result, I believe, of primarily of the knife intifada and the Israeli reaction to it that began in late 2015. And so today, the vast majority, even of East Jerusalem Palestinians who enjoy many practical benefits from living under Israeli rule, reject that rule and want not to end the conflict, but someday in their hearts to take over all of Israel instead. They don't act upon those feelings for the most part, because when I ask them, or I ask Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza, why isn't there an intifada? Why aren't you firing rockets against Israel? Or why don't you want that to happen? The Palestinians will tell you it's because we're afraid of the Israeli reaction. It's because we're afraid of the reaction of our own Palestinian governments if there's too much violence and chaos and trouble with Israel. It's because we don't trust our own leaders, our own Palestinian leaders, to conduct an intifada or an armed confrontation with Israel in a successful way. And it's because we're more concerned about the conditions of our daily lives than we are about politics. So, to sum up, Palestinian public opinion has drifted in a more militant direction as far as their ultimate aspirations. But that does not mean that the Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza or in East Jerusalem, for the most part, 3/4 of them in each place, that does not mean that they want an armed confrontation with Israel now, even if Israel does go ahead with a program of annexation in the West Bank. Now I want to talk very briefly about another division in Palestinian public opinion, and that's between the public and the elite, the leadership. Because what we see, and this is, I would say, in my own view at least, more encouraging news than what I just told you about. What we see is that at least on short-term questions, questions of tactics toward Israel, or of practical cooperation or coexistence with Israel today, the Palestinian public is actually much more moderate than the official party line, coming either from Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, or from Hamas in Gaza. And a few examples of that will suffice to make the point. If you ask the Palestinian population whether they would accept limiting the right of return of Palestinian refugees so that they could return only to the West Bank or Gaza, but not to Israel, the Palestinian public says by typically a 60% majority, okay. But the Palestinian leadership says, no, that's not good enough for us. If you ask the Palestinian public, and this is a startling statistic, should the Palestinian Authority stop paying salaries and extra bonuses to convicted terrorists in Israeli prisons? And I don't use the word terrorists in the poll, I say just prisoners. Should the PA stop making those special payments to convicted prisoners in Israeli jails? In the latest poll, 2/3 of the Palestinians in the West Bank said yes, the PA should stop doing that. But the PA says, no, we're not going to stop. And the PA claims that it can't stop making those payments because of pressure from the Palestinian public. The polls show that simply is not the case. If you ask the Palestinian public, do you want to boycott Israel, or do you want economic cooperation with Israel? Do you want jobs in Israel? Do you want Israeli investment and Israeli companies working in your part of Palestine? The Palestinians say, especially in Gaza, we want economic cooperation with Israel. We don't want to boycott Israel. We want Israeli jobs in Gaza, and we want to be able to work in Israel as we used to do one day. And again, in that respect, the Palestinian public, especially in Gaza, much to everyone's surprise when they see these polling results, is significantly more moderate toward Israel on such practical, shorter-term issues than is its own leadership. One other divide that I want to mention is the generational divide. There are some people who would like to think that the younger generation of Palestinians, because they're on social media, because they're better educated, because they have more familiarity with the outside world and with Israel, that they are more moderate than the older generation. Well, on this point, I have to say, unfortunately, that is not the case. The numbers show, and in the most recent poll, I did an actual demographic statistical breakout of the sample. I cut the sample in half among those under 30 and those over 30, exactly half the sample is under 30, 18 to 30, and the other half over 30. And what I found was that on some short-term issues, like economic cooperation with Israel, yes, the Palestinian younger generation is more moderate. But no, on longer-term issues, like permanent peace with Israel, like accepting a two-state solution as the end of conflict with Israel, as opposed to aspiring someday to regain all of Palestine for the Palestinians, the younger generation of Palestinians is no more moderate than the older one. And now I'm going to talk about one last divide, which is the divide between Palestinian public opinion and other Arabs. Here we can see that if you look at Palestinian public opinion compared to other Arabs, where I've polled in the last month, actually, brand new polling data from other Arab countries, you can see that the majority of Palestinians and of other Arabs agree that internal political and economic reform is more important to them than any foreign policy issue, whether it's Israel or anything else. And this is why I think the Palestinians and many other Arabs in the other countries that I've been polling, and what you see here are polling results from Saudi Arabia, from the United Arab Emirates, from Egypt, and from Jordan, alongside the Palestinians in the first bar. The majority of people in all of those places, despite the hardships that they undergo, feel that their own situation could be a lot worse. And that what people in other Arab countries that are subject to civil war today, in Syria or Yemen, for example, have it much worse. And this helps to explain, and I will end with this, why despite their long-term aspirations against Israel, the Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in East Jerusalem are not inclined today to rise up en masse against Israel, and rather to feel that their own situation, difficult as it is not as bad as that of people who are faced with armed conflict in their very own neighborhoods. So I will end with that and turn over the discussion to our other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I'll turn it over now to you, Tamar, on what you heard from Dave. How does it look from Israel?
Well, thank you, David. I think it was an eye-opener to see all the data here. But I must also say that I am highly concerned that if the data is transmitted to the Israeli public, the reaction would be very, very negative. Very negative. And I think that this might strengthen a very specific chunk of the political spectrum, meaning right of center, and this may cause some very problematic development within Israel. Unlike other occasions when I had one presentation that normally goes through the Israeli public opinion, I'd like to react to specific issues that David mentioned in order to explain why I'm so worried about the dissemination of these data. Of course, the title Nation Divided fits Israel very well, because Israel is a divided nation for a long time now between left and right. Left and right used to be mainly about the Palestinian issue. This is not the case anymore these days, but let's focus on this Israeli versus Palestinian issue as the main subject in Israeli politics. However, it is not evenly divided between the right and the left. when we try to figure out how many Israelis are on each side, we find about 15% defining themselves as being on the left. We have about 35% being in the center, and the rest, meaning between 50 to 60%, define themselves as being on the right, okay? And the people on the right, one of the main explanation of them being on the right regarding the Palestinian issue, I'm not talking now about economics and social issues and other issues, is the explanation which you gave, Dave. They say that a two-state solution would not put an end to the Palestinian aspiration of having one Palestinian state from the Jordan River to the sea. They say that the left actually have been misleading the Israeli public by saying, okay, let's compromise on the territories, let's withdraw from the West Bank, let's remark the green line, and then we are going to have peace. They often said, you're totally wrong. This would be only the first step in the direction of establishing a Palestine from the river to the sea. And you are naive, you don't understand what the real aspirations of the Palestinians are. And the leaders of the left and even of the center made a huge effort throughout the years to say, no, this is not true. The problem is that we didn't give them anything. But now, even if on the practical level, they are much more moderate. If this is the overt statement regarding their dream, even as a dream, not even as a political strategy, then the ability of mobilizing Israeli Jewish public opinion and even Arab public opinion within Israel to support a two-state solution, this actually pulls the rug from under the feet of all those who are saying the two-state solution is, we don't like to use this term, but a final solution, a solution that will put an end to the historical conflict between Jews and Arabs. And then I'll move to the younger generation. And this is amazing because this is exactly what happens on the Jewish side. On the Jewish side, the younger age cohort are more hawkish than the parents' generation in most cases. So one explanation is that they grew up during the Second Intifada and during the various military campaigns, and because they have just experienced their military service, which made them more militaristic or hawkish. But there is another explanation to that, is that the demographic share in these groups of the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox youngsters is going higher because of the higher birth rate of these two subcategories in Israeli Jewish population. And we know how strong is the correlation between a person's level of religiosity, being national Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, and their self-locating or self-positioning politically on the right. Actually, when we have ultra-Orthodox samples and we ask them, where do you put yourself on the continuum between left and right, 100% put themselves on the very right side of the political spectrum. Amongst the national Orthodox, it's about, say, 75%, okay? So if they have between 5 to 7 and even 8 children, and these children normally stay with their own communities, and they actually radicalize their views as a kind of youth rebellion against their parents. In their rebellion, they do not move to the center and the left. Most of them move to the right of their parents. Then we have young generations on both sides who are less open to the option of compromise, and compromising over dreams is something which young people are not very open to this idea. And what's the dream of the ultra-Orthodox and the National Orthodox on the Israeli side? Annexation of all territories to a one state, but not a one state with equal rights to both Jews and Arabs, but a Jewish state with a minor democratic feature, because religious people in Israel are not too fond of the democratic aspect of this hyphenated definition of Israel as Jewish and democratic. So if something is not done very, very quickly, we can see in the horizon some massive clash between these two nations. And indeed, even though David said that the Palestinians are not keen on having a third intifada because Israel is stronger, and indeed Israel is stronger. I mean, as politically correct as we try to be, I mean, there is a total imbalance in military capabilities and all other capabilities. And the most helpful from the Israeli side capability was the capability of the security agencies to infiltrate the Palestinian society, not like the army or the military excursions into the Palestinian Authority territories, but the fact that they managed to mobilize collaborators within the Palestinian society, thereby actually dismantling the social fabric within the Palestinian society. And Palestinians are very well aware of it and very afraid of it. And when we have in April our sample of Jewish Israelis, what are the chances that a third intifada will break out if an annexation will be implemented? Almost 60% expected a third intifada. So even that, on that issue, there is no correlation between what the Palestinians are ready to do or willing to do and what the Israelis expect them to do. And people operate and make moves by their expectations. And another and final expectations, which I'd like to put on the table here, is that indeed the Israeli Jewish public is divided between those in favor and those who are against a two-state solution. In the latest poll, it was found 45% here, 45% there. But by the way, when we asked about a binational state a la Peter Beinart, 12% of the Jews said, okay, we will opt for a binational state with equal rights for Jews and Arabs. But when we asked them, what is the likelihood of all these solutions to become a reality, most people say none. The status quo is going to continue until the end of days. I mean, neither the two-state solution nor the one-state solution nor an apartheid-style solution with no rights for the Palestinians. But as things are now, things will continue. And this is mainly for two reasons, and this will be my last explanation. First, for the Israeli side, the status quo is good. I mean, they don't feel that they pay any price, not in terms of the economy, not in terms of national security, but not even in terms of international public opinion. Because, of course, people say occupation is bad and so on and so forth. But for example, commerce with Israel is extremely successful and prosperous with even Europe, not even the United States. And there are new markets, China, India, Russia, large economies that are not very concerned with human rights or with ongoing occupation. So from the economic point of view, the situation until the corona crisis was very good and security was very good. And as of today, the corona crisis took over everything. And the issue of the two-state solution is actually non-existent in the public discourse. There is a song in Hebrew saying, things that you see from here, you don't see from there, okay? And whenever I talk to foreign audiences, the people there are sure that the two-state solution is something that Israelis discuss during breakfast, lunch, and dinner, over coffee, and when they have family gathering. The answer is no. Israelis do not talk anymore about the two-state solution or any other solution, okay? And when annexation was in the horizon, some people were for, some were against, but when we asked them, is it going to happen? The majority said no, okay? So as we got close to July 1st, which was the date in which Prime Minister Netanyahu could have put on the table his annexation policy, more and more people said he's not going to do it. And indeed, he didn't do it. And therefore, people who would like to have the situation to become better should keep in mind is that on one side, the occupation and the two-state solution is something that is actually very, very central to the collective cognition, whereas on the other side, it is actually very much on the side. Thank you very much.
All right, move over to Ray. Thank you, Tamar, very much. And Ray, love to hear your perspective on what you heard today.
Thank you very much, David. And let me start maybe with echoing what David Makovsky said at the very beginning. This is an extremely rich study that David Pollock has produced. And we're only skimming the surface of it. And I really strongly recommend that people who care about the nuances of the situation to actually take a deeper look and to read this study. Now, this has been a very rich conversation, and I will maybe quickly have four quick comments and conclude with what this means from a policy prescription point of view. My first comment is that the findings, and I'm focusing on the two-state solution side of things, are not surprising. They're not surprising. We've seen the trend happening. There are many reasons for it, but prime among these reasons, I believe, is failure. At the end of the day, the promise of a two-state solution of diplomacy has failed. And for the older generation, they've seen their promises and their hopes dashed. For the younger generation, they've only seen failure, and they've only seen the worst of the other side. And one reason why the two-state solution is actually diminishing is a point that Tamar mentioned on the Israeli side, but we see a mirror image on the Palestinian side, the belief that there is no partner. Palestinians do see Tamar and other Israeli pollsters' view. They follow Israeli media, and they are aware, and they have a sense that there is no partner on the other side. And this is a mutually reinforcing dynamic. Now, a point that both the previous speakers mentioned is that just because the two-state solution is losing credibility doesn't mean that we're going to end up with a positive utopian alternative of this one state for with equal rights, etc., etc. No, what we end up with is maximalism. Maximalism, we're seeing it on the Israeli side with annexation and the rejection of the very idea of a Palestinian state. And we're seeing it in this, in Dave's studies and other studies that show that the Palestinians are also moving to the maximalist from the river to the sea kind of narrative. Again, this is not surprising. If you look at the very foundation of why a two-state solution was adopted, it was never really about embracing the narrative of the other. It was always about a realization that in order to achieve the national and nationalistic objective of each group, there has to be a compromise. Neither side is going to disappear, and to get your own national aspirations, you have to accept dividing the land, and that's what a two-state solution is about. When that disappears, it doesn't mean that nationalism will die. Nationalism will continue, but will express itself in maximalist view forms in the same way that we saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And indeed, what I see today in terms of the views is very reminiscent of that. For anyone who is advocating for a post-two-state solution reality, I think this is a cautionary note, and we should never, ever underestimate the strength of nationalism among both societies. At the end of the day, Palestinians want a Palestinian state, whether in a two-state solution or in a maximalist one-state idea, and Zionists also want a Jewish state, whether in a two-state solution or in a maximalist view, and these are not going to change. Then there is the issue, the third point is the difference between tactical and strategic issues, which I actually disagree with you, Dave, in terms of the labeling. I would say political issues and aspirational issues. Because for me, things like the right of return are not tactical. These are strategic and these are key. But I think what you were talking about is the kind of historic issues of attachment, legitimacy, etc., things of this sort. The big question for me is, does this matter? I mean, I'm not disputing the findings, and indeed there are other polls that show the same, and anecdotally, we see that to be the case. But the question is, does it matter? And at some levels, it does, of course. It does because in its own right, acceptance of various narratives is a value that should be cherished in its own right. It matters because negative or rejection of the other's legitimacy only strengthens the hardens the views on the other side, and this is a point that Tamar mentioned. And it matters because when you have a public that's not willing to compromise, it's more difficult for the leaders, politically speaking, to reach compromises. Yet, at a different level, while it matters, it is not fatal. And here, I very quickly will just point out to two examples. The peace that Israel has with Jordan and with Egypt. Both cases, we've had very stable peace agreements. In the Egyptian case, even under a Muslim Brotherhood government. And in both cases, I would be very, very hard-pressed to find Jordanians or Egyptians who actually accept Israel's right to exist, or in the very long term, think that Israel will be there to stay. Yet, I think at the end of the day, it is creating a new political reality and new sets of real sets of incentives for both nations is what makes a peace treaty stable, not necessarily these issues. And I would rather focus, while we should try to improve and the narrative aspect, we should focus on the practical aspect. The fourth point is which I found remarkable, is the point that you, Dave, mentioned, is the issue of how public opinion changes. And how in some instances, especially as we saw in East Jerusalem, it changes very quickly and very radically. Now, this has many implications, this comment. Some of the changes are negative, yet, as you mentioned, we see some positive changes when it comes to the short-term issues. This ability to change worries me about the question of a potential of a third intifada. I see the polling and I see different polling and I talk to people there and I tend to agree with the sense that people do not want a third intifada for many reasons, not least of which, as you mentioned, they're scarred from the second intifada. But this can change very quickly. And to ignite a confrontation does not require public will. And if it starts spinning out of control, public opinions could change. So I continue to worry. I wouldn't have too much comfort in the snapshot that we have today that's going to predict how things will develop. But a big question here about the change of opinions is what causes these changes. Some of the reasons for change are objective, external. As you mentioned in the Jerusalem case, it was the knife intifada and the Israeli reaction. But sometimes there's a question of whether or not leadership can shift public opinion. And there is no doubt that it can. And we've seen it over and over. We've seen it in the Oslo process. We've seen it in the Camp David I process. We've seen it in the Gaza disengagement process, how leadership does change public opinion. But to do that, that's the positive, that's the optimistic side of my comment. The pessimistic side of my comment is that to do that, you need leaders who have credibility and who have mastery of their political homes. And here, I am more pessimistic. Tamar mentioned some of the structural issues that we have in Israel, and I will not dwell on these. I look at the Palestinians, I look at the issue of credibility and legitimacy, and whether it is in your polls, Dave, or Khalil Shikaki's polls, we see a tremendous, tremendous legitimacy gap. Partly because of the Palestinian leadership's failure to achieve independence via negotiations and via diplomacy, but partly because of the failure of the Palestinian leadership to govern and to produce a model of good governance. And unless we start addressing both of these issues, I believe that we will not have leaders. It will be very difficult to produce leaders who have the legitimacy and credibility to shift their publics. So what does that mean in policy and practical terms? I think there are two sets of issues. First of all, it gives us a sense of what not to do. If we accept that the public opinion is moving further away from a two-state solution, policies that will reinforce the idea that two-state solutions are dead can only harm. And here I'm specifically thinking about annexation. There are other issues that we can talk about. Similarly, I think if we accept that failure is a big reason why this disbelief is happening, the last thing we need right now is big policy initiatives that will fail. Whether it is the Trump peace plan, and frankly, before him, whether it was the Obama peace plan, I think big initiatives that are bound to fail because of the realities on the ground will do more harm than good in this case. Yet, there are things that can be done. I think we need to refocus, first, on the issue of Palestinian governance, not as a condition for anything, but as a necessary prerequisite, I believe, to create a Palestinian political reality where the leadership has legitimacy that enables it to address some of the decisions, some of the major decisions that we need to make if we want to move back to a two-state solution. But beyond that, I think there's a lot that we can do on the bilateral level. And here, there is actually a lot of positive dynamics that we saw. Most recently, the practical cooperation against COVID, even though the narrative and the messaging was not as good in reality, we've seen a lot of cooperation. And I think we can focus on a lot of these non-controversial issues that relate whether to economy, but beyond the economy. Issues that enable the Palestinian Authority to exert more control in areas in the West Bank, et cetera, as long as security cooperation and the security situation remains the same, we can focus on some of these deliverables. Now, these deliverables will not resolve the conflict. Ultimately, things like Jerusalem, right of return, borders will have to be agreed in a diplomatic process. But these small concrete things will do a number of things. They will create a sense of momentum that is key. When all the developments now are negative, this will be a positive dynamic. And they will help recreate the sense that there is a partner by showing the Israelis that they have partners they can rely on the Palestinian side to maintain security, show the Palestinians that Israelis are capable of doing positive things to them if the time is right. Now, many political commentators will disagree with this, and probably the Palestinian Authority will disagree with this. And I will conclude, though, with maybe a point of optimism from Dave's study, is that the Palestinian public will be supportive of these kinds of moves. Mm-hmm. Not as a replacement for their national rights, etc., but as moves that the Palestinian public is anticipating, and I think the Palestinian public in this particular case has the capacity to surprise us, as it did many times in the past, as it did in its adoption and embrace of Oslo, and as it did in its embrace of the Gaza disengagement, despite the political classes and the elites and the Palestinian society being against these. With this, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. Okay, here's the thing. We only really have one round because we're already coming up on a full hour, and we don't want to go too much beyond that. So I'm going to ask one set of questions to each, and also ask if you've heard anything you want to respond to others, fine, but this is the only round, essentially. So, Dave, I'll start with you, obviously, and I'll pick up something that Raith said and was very much in your study about the difference between the aspirational and the operational. Mm-hmm. And if you polled, and I'm sure you do, Jordanians and Egyptians today, what are their views about the legitimacy of Zionism? And, do they see Israel as a permanent fixture in the Middle East? Their numbers might not be too great. And yet the peace holds because of common interests of the leadership on both sides. Yeah. And I just want you to relate to that if you could, and that shows that, I don't want people to be too depressed coming out of this session about longer term views, is to what extent does leadership make a difference under the idea that, leadership represents the common interest that could be very durable sustainable over time. With Egypt and Jordan, there might be, security, a fight against jihadis, views about Iran, ISIS, you name it. So if you could relate to that. Now, just one question that came in through the chat. If someone asks you about a younger generation of Palestinians in your polls and their views,
yes,
how much of those views are shaped by, I don't know, religion, by their ethnic socialization, how much it is the importance of the school system, which has gotten a lot of attention in certain circles?
Okay, well, great. Thank you for those questions. And thanks to my fellow panelists for what I honestly and sincerely thought were terrific sets of comments and suggestions. And the answer to your first question is, I do believe that just as Palestinian public opinion has moved in a negative direction toward Israel in the last decade, and especially in the last 5 years, I believe it can move back again in a more positive direction, depending on circumstances and expectations and maybe to some extent leadership. So, and in fact, I started my talk by saying, if there's any one thing I want you to take from this, it's that Palestinian public opinion changes over time in response to circumstances. And it even differs depending on which geographic area you're looking at, or what kinds of issues you're looking at. So that's one reason, I wouldn't say exactly for optimism, but at least for, let's say, the possibility of a different outcome someday, right? Palestinian public opinion can change back in a more moderate direction when you could have, as you did 10 years ago, a majority saying, yes, two-state solution, yes, that should be the end of conflict. Even if they didn't necessarily recognize Israel's right to exist, they agreed 10 years ago that the two-state solution should end the conflict in the interest of both sides. That could happen again someday. So that's number one. Number two is a harder question. What if Palestinian public opinion does not change in a more positive direction? Can there still be a lasting peace between Israel and a Palestinian state if the Palestinian public continues to reject that as the permanent settlement of the conflict? And my answer to that is guarded, in the sense that I don't think it's the same as Egypt and Jordan. I agree that Egypt and Jordan have kept the peace with Israel religiously, so to speak, even though public opinion in those countries is not exactly pro-Israeli. In fact, it's very negative toward Israel. My most recent poll showed that only about 10% of Egyptians or Jordanians think that it's okay to have business or other contacts with Israelis. 25 years after the peace treaty in the case of Jordan, 40 years after the peace treaty in the case of Egypt. That's what people still think. And yet peace endures. But the Palestinians are a different case. They live next door to Israel. They live intermingled with Israelis. They have irredentist claims on Israeli territory. They have a major political organization named Hamas that is dedicated to reclaiming all of historical Palestine. And even Fatah is dedicated in its official program to regaining all of historic Palestine, or at least to returning all of the Palestinian refugees to pre-1967 Israel someday. So in that respect, I think if public opinion on the Palestinian side continues to reject permanent peace with Israel, that's a much bigger problem than it is for Egypt or Jordan. And I agree with Tamar. Unfortunately, this is going to serve as ammunition for the Israeli hardline right, saying, look, the Palestinians don't want peace either. So why are you blaming us? But the facts are the facts. And I think we need to be very open-minded about what public opinion really is on the Palestinian side, while recognizing that it might change for the better someday. And I hope it does. Now, as far as leadership goes, I agree that leaders can sway public opinion, and to some extent, and sometimes leaders do things that are actually very unpopular, but they do them anyway, because they believe, in some cases rightly, in other cases wrongly, that it's in the best national interest of their own people, and that they know better than their own public what might be good for them in the long run. So in the case of the Palestinians, in addition to what Ghaith said about the leadership being lacking a great deal of legitimacy and credibility, I would say this. The numbers show that the Palestinian public not only doesn't trust its own leaders, either in Gaza or in the West Bank, but that they don't believe much of what their leaders say. And in fact, they don't even pay attention in many cases, most cases. The numbers in these surveys demonstrate to what the official party line is, what the official media, for example, either of the PA or of Hamas are saying or claiming. And as far as education, I think it's an important issue. I think it's possible to imagine a different future in which the Palestinians are educated by their own leaders, but even more so by their own peers, to peace as the answer to the occupation and the answer to their long-term aspirations, when that has not been the case until now. And ultimately, in the long term, that can make a real difference. People can actually, a whole nation can collectively change its mind and toward a more peaceful outlook toward their neighbors. We've seen that in other conflicts in the modern world, in Europe and elsewhere, and I can imagine that that could conceivably happen among the Palestinians as well someday. But it's going to have to come from both sides. The Palestinians do need to believe, as our other panelists said, that they have a partner on the Israeli side who will also be willing to compromise. And I think until they see that, no amount of leadership, even if we had it on the Palestinian side, no amount of education or outreach would suffice to make this change possible.
Okay, so Tamar, my question to you, and also any final thoughts you may have, is on this issue of the nexus between leadership and public opinion in Israel. I mean, I remember still the old days, Moshe Dayan used to say, better Sharm el-Sheikh than peace. Then Menachem Begin gave away Sharm el-Sheikh for peace, and the public supported that. I remember during the Shamir period, the public said, if Israel is attacked by Scuds by Saddam Hussein, Israel will react. 90% or something. The numbers were unbelievable. Then Shamir decided, you know what, this is not in Israel's interest to divide the coalition during the Gulf War. And he didn't react. And the public supported that too. The public has an ability, the leaders have ability to make decisions, despite public opinion, but also to change public opinion. And I just wanted you to reflect on that point in terms of, and also the ability of Israel even to reach out a bit to the other side. What is possible on that? We don't see that happening that often. We don't see Benjamin Netanyahu saying, I want to go on Al Arabiya and explain Israel's positions to the Palestinians themselves. Maybe you think it just can't happen in Israel. But I'm just thinking leaders, I've seen this, where the public is at a fixed position and the leaders go the other way because they think it's the right thing to do, and they end up moving public opinion. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
I'll have two answers to your question, very short ones, because the situation now is really amazing. The first answer is that by and large, Israeli public opinion is more dovish than its leaders for a long time now. I mean, the resistance comes top down and not bottom up. So this is not a question of switching public opinion. It is just public opinion looking at its leaders, and the only signals coming from above are negative about it. We hardly have any other kind of leadership. But what's more terrible, I would say these days, really terrible, is that we don't have leaders. There is no leadership in Israel right now. When we look at the way that the corona crisis was handled by the so-called leaders, people are looking up and are saying, There is no one there. There is no captain that navigate the ship wherever. I've never seen such a crisis of confidence in the leadership that we are seeing these days. Netanyahu's trust in Netanyahu's ability to handle the corona crisis dropped in 2 months from 60% to 29%. I mean, there is a minority in Israel that sees him as a capable leader. Netanyahu, the top leader of Israel, let alone others, Gantz and others. So basically, we face a new situation where there is no question of the grassroots following the leaders because they don't see any leadership there. So we should wait a bit in order to see if things will turn in the more positive direction. But some people say that we are on the verge of some kind of civil unrest, civil protest, maybe even some civil resistance. So this is not the right day to ask me about leaders and followers.
Okay. All right. My final question, you got the last word, Ghaith, on this, is your unique position. Like Dave worked at the State Department, was really a key figure in really talking about the role of polling data in the Middle East. You worked once for Mahmoud Abbas when he was prime minister, but briefly also when he was president. You were on the negotiating team at Camp David. And I just want put us inside the room in Ramallah of Abbas. And because for all Dave's points that are about long-term and saying it could change, but he also said that on the shorter-term issues, when it comes to practical cooperation, the public is actually ahead of the leaders. And he pointed to very specific points, like the payments of prisoners is an example, like more economic cooperation. I guess I'm trying to get from you is a sense of how does the Palestinian leadership see Palestinian public polling data? As we talk about these hardest of questions, how do they digest it? How much does it a calculation in their thinking? Doesn't it enable them to go further, but they don't maybe want to go further in certain areas? So, and is there any shift? Has social media changed it from maybe your day when you worked with Abbas in the early 2000s? You know, is it more permeable? Do you think they will be more responsive to public opinion and some of these shorter term issues that actually gives them more flexibility, more room to maneuver, and does not box them in? How do they interpret this data? How much do are they consumers of this data?
Look, there's a major difference between what we see today at Abbas and the way Arafat used to conduct his politics. Arafat used to look into polls, but also have a lot of one-on-one engagement with the Palestinian public, which allowed him to have a good sense of the pulse of the public. With Abbas, that's not the case. I think Abbas is a leader who is more attuned to, if you wish, palace politics than popular politics. His whole political background kind of lends itself to this mode of governance. What we see is actually in many ways, and I think he himself, Abbas, has said that he is on many of these issues actually quite conciliatory, whether it's the right of return, what's all of these end of conflict. I mean, if you look at his negotiation history, whether in Camp David and post Camp David, privately, he would be someone who is willing to make these kinds of compromises. Yet he is much, much more sensitive to the views among the elites than he is to the views among the public. He is much more worried about what leaderships of Fatah or PLO or even Hamas would see him than he is with the public. And I don't think he had ever felt confident in using the public support as a way of countering elite views. Again, here he's unlike Arafat. I mean, when I look back at Oslo was an agreement that was opposed by a good segment of the Palestinian elite, including in Fatah and in the PLO itself. Arafat bet and rightly so, that the public will support him. Abbas is unwilling to make these kinds of bets. Add to it the fact that
Why is that? Why is that?
I mean, part of it is the fact that that's not how he is used to do politics. He is not someone who grew up in, the trenches of Lebanon or the camps of Jordan. He is someone who grew up mainly, politically speaking, in the PLO offices in Damascus or in the Soviet Union. So his own experience is lacking in that. And his mode of governance is different. He is not a leader who is very comfortable among the public. I mean, look at how many pictures you will see with him surrounded by average Palestinians. The views that he gets are very filtered. And therefore, whoever filters the view, the public opinion to him, gets to sway him, and he has no direct engagement with his public. But also, he is someone who I think is aware that he is unpopular, at least in recent days. I mean, it's not only Dave's polls that show that, Shikaki and other show that around 80%, I think around 70% of the Palestinians, give or take, want him to resign. And when you have a leader who is feeling this insecure, he tends to move more to gravitate more towards the safe and hard line than the risky and progressive. So I think a combination of his own political background, but also his current awareness of his political standing, produce a much more hardline person than his own personal views might tend to be.
Okay, well, thank all three of you for this very rich and very sobering discussion. I hope for our viewers on Facebook Live, they gained as well. I urge everyone to look at Dave Pollock's new study, A Nation Divided, to order it at the way we said, I think on a policy forum at washingtoninstitute.org. A really fascinating comparative look at 10 years of polling, in-depth polling about long-term issues, and to see how they change or don't change over time. And I urge all our viewers also to come and tune in another edition soon enough, I'm sure, of the virtual policy forums of the Washington Institute. In the meantime, I wish all of you to stay safe, to be in good health and good spirits. I'm David Makowski. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.